Today's town hall is a forum to reflect on that future, bringing together close to 400 participants who care about the future of genomics in Canada. Many of you have been part of the national conversation that Genome Canada hosted this fall and contributed to the report of those conversations that is being launched today. We will get into that momentarily. But first, we're going to start with opening remarks from Professor Claudette Commanda. After that, we will follow up with a fireside chat with President and CEO of Genome Canada, Rob Annan, and the Chief Scientific Officer, Catalina Lopez-Correa. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with me. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to ask you these questions and be in conversation with you. Rob, I'd like to start with you, please. And I'd like to ask you, where would you say genomics is at now in Canada and internationally, and why do we need a pan-Canadian genomic strategy?
Thanks, Nehal. This is great. And welcome, everyone. Really excited to be here. Nehal, first, let me just thank you and congratulate you and the rest of the people at Conversation Canada for all the great work you've been doing, certainly through the pandemic. Certainly the virus is a dangerous foe, but so is misinformation. And I know you and your colleagues did a phenomenal job there. So thank you for that. And also want to thank Elder Commanda for her sharing her knowledge and wisdom with us. I think it sets a really nice tone for the conversation here today, particularly this idea around, our roles as knowledge keepers ourselves in genomics, knowledge makers in some ways, but our commitment to community, understanding the past and looking to the future, which is actually a good segue to this question, because this really is an exciting time for genomics. And I know I'm biased, and I suspect many of the people joining us here today are a little biased, but nonetheless, I do think if we think back a little bit, we need to recall that genomics is actually still a pretty young science. The Human Genome Project was just 20 years ago, and we've come a long way in those 20 years, a long way. At the time, thinking back 20 years ago, that Human Genome Project was an international effort that took 15 years or so and several $1 billion just to sequence a single human reference genome. And today, we are sequencing human genomes for a few $100, and we're doing that in a matter of hours. So the science and technology has really come a long way, and in fact we're at, I think, a kind of a pivotal moment for genomics today, and that really is kind of due to the confluence of a couple of key factors. First, there's this ability to generate data, generate information, and understand the genetic information that is at the core of not just kind of our health and wellness, but also all living organisms. The ability to sequence genomes now, as we've gone from this idea of being able to sequence a single genome to large populations. It's just an explosion of data. It means that we have the ability to personalize our own approach to health and disease. So just the ability to actually read what is effectively the software of living things has just completely transformed in those 20 years. The second piece is really our ability to manage all of that data. Genomics is a data science. The one genome is big enough. Once you start getting to the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of genomes, it's enormous amounts of data. And until a couple of years ago, we weren't really even able to manage that data, never mind analyze it. But new tools, bioinformatics, using new tools from AI, for instance, is unlocking all sorts of discovery in the genome. And that's true in the human genome, but across other sectors as well. So that ability to manage the data. And then the third piece is really the tools that have been developed over these 20 years, the tools of biotechnology. And certainly, we think here about CRISPR and other gene editing approaches, but also what we've seen with mRNA vaccines during the pandemic and the rapidity with which those were developed and deployed, but also the broad array of tools that we think of as kind of engineering biology and so on, means that we can read the software really well and really quickly and really easily. We can manage enormous stores of data, and now we can actually work with that as well. And I think the confluence of these things has really created almost like a perfect storm now for genomic sciences that we think of as a biorevolution. I really do believe that the next 30 years or so will be impacted by this biorevolution in much the same way as the digital revolution has impacted the last 30 years. And that means, not only in the ways we think it will happen, but in lots of ways that we at this point can't even predict will happen. And so it's an exciting time to be in the science. I will say that, at Genome Canada, we've been in the game for just over 20 years now. We were created, in effect, in the shadow of the Human Genome Project. Canada wasn't actually a participant in the international effort to sequence the human genome, but scientists in Canada, we had phenomenal scientists in Canada who, in effect, convinced the government here to invest 20 years ago in the creation of Genome Canada, so that we could, in effect, build out an ecosystem across the country that would be able to take advantage of this opportunity. And we've done that. And I say we in the collective sense, because it really is a team effort in the kind of application and implementation of this knowledge in academic science, but also in industry, government, and beyond. So, I guess the question, where are we today? I think, we have a phenomenal foundation for genomic sciences. We have amazing structural components. For instance, we have sequencing facilities across the country that are world-class. We have a variety of other technology facilities, data facilities, and so on. We have the human side, unbelievably talented researchers working in this space, systems to train students, which are really phenomenal. And that's true both on the technical side as well as on the data side, as well as on the, I would say the ethical, the environmental, what we call our GELs, the ethical, environmental, economic, legal, and social implications of genomics. So, I think that we've got a lot of strengths, but as the system has grown, it has fragmented. And I think, some of this is inherent to Canada. We have a federated system, particularly in the health space, that creates challenges with regards to coordination and collaboration within the health portfolio. But it's also just a feature of the complications or the complexity of the science and the connections it has to a number of different areas that over time the system has, in a sense, sort of fragmented out. And as the connections have grown into spaces like industry, for instance, little bits and pieces have perhaps, not been built out to the way that they need to be. So I think that's why the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy is a very welcome step. It's an opportunity to stop and say, okay, let's have a big picture view. Where are we today? We know we have solid foundations. We know we've built a really strong system. But now, how do we make sure that system is working together, that it's connecting to, kind of adjacent areas like AI, for instance, and that's connecting downstream into, industry, into uptake by our clinical systems and so on, and connecting internationally, because genomics is an international science. So for all those reasons, I think lots of strengths, but it's a perfect time for a bit of a system view right now.
Thank you for that. I'm really excited actually to talk to you about the confluence of genomics and technology and AI and all of these different things that come together, because once you start looking at genomics and understanding it more and more as a layperson, you realize how the possibilities of it just kind of unfold and multiply. Catalina, I'd like to ask you, what do you hope that this genomic strategy will do for Canada? And what does it look like when it's successful?
Well, first, je voudrais commencer par vous remercier, Nehal et Claudette Commanda pour l'ouverture aujourd'hui. Je voudrais aussi faire un grand merci à tous les participants. C'est vraiment un plaisir de parler aujourd'hui du futur de la génomique et d'être ici avec vous ce matin. Well, for us, we had 3 very successful roundtables, and those roundtables are really leading us towards a new Pan-Canadian genomic strategy. There have been an amazing consultation, an amazing source of information that are really opening the path through this information for the future of genomics. So across all these 3 roundtables, there is a clear picture that is emerging for the need of a really concerted and aligned genomic strategy that will address global challenges. And we actually saw that very clearly with Cancogen. Cancogen was a clear example on how we use genomics to help us drive and really use a whole new technology to address this challenge of the pandemic. So today we launch a summary report from our national dialogue. So you will see this report, and there will be a link posted in there's a link. I encourage you all to have a look at this report. It contains really a lot of the key messages that we captured during these 3 roundtables. You can click on the link and you can have access to the report in English and French. And some of the key messages that are coming from that report are really the need for a coherent genomic research and innovation ecosystem that will mobilize the scientific, human resources, infrastructure, and data capacity that is already present in Canada, and all aligned around shared priorities. And that was, again, a key message that came. So first, using what we have built over the last 20 years and aligning all these really towards a shared national priority. There came really several messages on the need to prioritize, the need to not just do everything a little bit, but really focus on something that we can do cohesive and that we can build as a priority for Canada. There is also the need for coordination, coordinated efforts, and those coordinated efforts that will drive cross-sectorial, diverse, and dynamic collaboration. So cross sectors also, as you know, Genome Canada covers climate change, agri-food, health. We cover the mining sector, environment, forestry. So that cross-sectorial and that diversity that we're bringing to the table will help us focus on a more equitable impact and also a more inclusive genomics. So bringing the equity and bringing a genomics that is more inclusive, that is more diverse, and that is cross-sectorial also came as another key message. The participants also stress that Canada diversity is a strength and that we can work together to bring forward the value of this diversity and this cross-sectorial diversity and this very diverse ecosystem that we have. And that diversity really will be key to drive the future genomic strategy. During the roundtable, we had great keynotes from the UK, from Norway. Many of you that are on this call today participated in those roundtables. And we saw that key considerations for us in Canada are really could be very well informed by this Norwegian and the UK strategy. In particular from Norway, we saw that mission-driven approach and innovation and research that are mission-driven are really helping address societal challenges. And from the UK, we saw that they have an amazingly ambitious plan for 10 years to really enter and put genomics at the center of their healthcare strategy. So all this is helping us drive the future of genomics and helping us develop really the plan and the pan-Canadian strategy for the application and use of genomics in Canada.
Thank you, Catalina. To follow on from what Catalina just said, Rob, as we consider the future of genomics and the development of the strategy, it's going to be important to really understand our challenges and opportunities. What do you think those are, and how do you think that genomics could be applied to them?
Great, thanks. So I think there's a couple ways to kind of approach this. I think in the big picture, in terms of the challenges, I think genomics has demonstrated during the pandemic, for instance, the way in which knowledge is power when it comes to the pandemic, but health more generally. So the ability to actually track the viral spread and evolution has been crucial to observing variants, to the development of the vaccines. Certainly going forward, there are enormous opportunities for genomics in terms of precision health. We can get into all of this a little bit more later, but around precision health, particularly with regards to rare disease, cancer, and other inherited diseases, I think there's enormous opportunities when it comes to the impact on climate, whether we're thinking here about mitigation by improving sort of carbon capture when it comes to, say, for instance, agriculture and soil, when it comes to alternative energy sources. There's lots of things we can do using genomics, but also when it comes to adaptation, we're going to have to be ready to work in a new world. And we think about, again, food and agriculture, forestry, and so on, and the ability to improve breeding, both time and quality, is going to be crucial. So there are big sector opportunities there. I think there are some challenges, and here I think more about maybe some systems challenges we have internally. I mentioned off the top the challenge around fragmentation of the system. I think that this is something that we're going to need to grapple with here, particularly in Canada. We can't really impose a sort of a central approach the way that you can in some countries, like in the UK, where they have the National Health Service. Here, we're going to need to be thinking more broadly around, kind of federated approaches. We're also going to have to be, thinking about the way we've, in a sense, built out and evolved our overall research ecosystem, and find solutions that are going to work in Canada, given the particularities of our current systems. We also tend to silo, and this isn't just a genomics issue, this is broadly, we tend to silo our sectors and think about, well, agriculture's over here, health is over there, the environment is yet another area. We really do need to start thinking about the ways in those pieces are interacting. We see this, for instance, in the One Health approach around issues that involve, for instance, antimicrobial resistance and the way that environment, agriculture, and health interact. We see this with the pandemic, and we think about other zoonotic diseases and the way the environment interacts with human health. So the ability to work between these sectors, I think, is going to be important, and also the fragmentation that exists sometimes between the sectors that are doing research and development and innovation. So the university and sector, the college sector, but then you have government science, a lot of great science happening within government. And then industry. And we need those pieces to come together in a way that isn't always easy, actually. So I think that's one big challenge. The second big challenge I want to flag is issues around data sharing. Again, we have particular challenges in Canada around data sharing, but this is true at the local level, regionally, nationally, and even internationally. There's, I think, a recognition that sharing data is crucial. Again, we've seen this during COVID. It's absolutely essential for us to share that data broadly, whether that's at the national level or the international level, but that creates real challenges. There's challenges about how do we balance out issues, I think, legitimate issues around privacy, around data governance. How do we ensure that the data is used in a way that is equitable and that it isn't extractive from participants in order to benefit the few? We need to be thinking about just ways that we can smooth out the speed with which we can actually share data. So I know that these are big issues. I think actually, I know there's a national task force looking at health data information. I believe they issued a report today, or maybe it's tomorrow that it's coming out, led by Dr. Vivek Goel. But I think so. There's some great work going on there, but it needs to be tackled, this issue around data sharing, and especially what that means on the international scale. But then I'll just end with a couple of quick opportunities. I think, again, off the top, I talked about the foundation that we have. We can really build on that. We do have phenomenal facilities here. We have phenomenal people in Canada working in genomics. I think that, we can build on that. But more than that, we can actually marry that genomics work with sectors where we already have strength. Unlike in, and I mean no disrespect to my colleagues in the digital sector, but there was always this urge of, how do we recreate Silicon Valley in the North? Well, in genomics, we don't need to create a Silicon Valley of the North. What we need to do is actually apply these tools and technologies and knowledge to sectors where we already have strength. Things like agriculture, things like forestry, oceans, energy. These are big strengths in the Canadian economy already, and genomics can really help drive those to be more productive, more innovative, and help Canada become a global leader. So I think that's a big opportunity for us. And then the last thing I'll say is we have a really big opportunity, and I would say even a responsibility, to take a much more inclusive approach to our work in genomics. And this is true, of course, across science, but in Canada and globally, genomic data sets are not representative of the human population writ large. We certainly at Genome Canada recognize that and are committed to filling the gaps that exist in the current data. But I think more collectively, there's a responsibility that goes beyond just the data, and we need to be thinking about the types of questions we're asking, the types of projects that are being supported, as well as the way those benefits are rolling out to society. So, we certainly have to do our part in Canada, and I would say that we have the opportunity to be very innovative about the way we approach some of these issues, particularly around privacy and consent and data governance and so on. And then to flag that we have, I think, a particular responsibility in Canada to build, strong bridges to Indigenous communities in Canada and make sure that that they are also helping not just sort of drive the thinking around genomics, but also accruing benefits from that. So those are a few thoughts on, I think, maybe some of the opportunities and challenges.
Thank you. They're all really huge questions, like how do you deal with privacy? How do you stay ahead of the technology that enables you to do all of these things, but still manage their ethical and social implications? So I do have a question about, where do you think the greatest need is, or what do you think the greatest need is in Canada, where genomics can actually have like significant and measurable impacts? And Catalina, I'll start with you first for that one. You're on mute.
Yeah, there are several. We have to have that absolutely. For a typical Zoom call, we need to have this. So I think there are many areas where genomics can have an impact. Health is a big one, and here on the chat we see some comments about large scale. Well, Cancogen is a $40 million initiative that has been funded to use genomics to help us inform public health and policy decisions during this pandemic. So this super large scale investment, the super large scale initiative, has helped really show the value of genomics. We're saying now that really genomics is out of the lab thanks to Cancogen, because now people are talking about genomics, are talking on how we're using genomics to track this virus, to understand now these new variants, Omicron. All these variants are being tracked and traced using genomics. So health, helping us understand, improving diagnosis, improving treatment. Health, of course, precision health, the use of genomics in the infectious diseases is a key application. And we know, the great advances the UK is doing on that area. We also see great potential in other areas. Think now we're all concerned about climate change. We're all concerned about well, I'm based in BC now. And, when I see the fires, when I see the rain, we're all having a clear impact of climate change. And genomics can be critical to help us address climate change. And we have been already, through Genome Canada funding, we have been working with the Genome Centers and with Genome Canada, of course, funding large-scale initiatives to help us use genomics to understand climate change. So when we think about how is our biodiversity changing, how are the different environments changing because of climate change, we can use genomics to help us map, to help us understand those impacts of climate change in our living organisms across the planet. We can also use genomics to help us adapt to climate change, and we have projects where we use genomics to adapt to crops to adapt to different climates, and to really be ready for what is bringing this climate change to our planet. And third, we can also use genomics to mitigate climate change, to help us absorb carbon. So climate change is another area where the impact for genomics is huge. Agriculture is another really important area where internationally the use and application of genomics has been has developed very, very fast, where we see concrete, not just potential for application, but also driving economic growth through the creation of companies, the creation of IP and value that comes out of genomics. So there's many areas, but as I say, health is a very important one. Climate change, a big one for us in Canada and in the world. Agriculture, forestry, basically, where is DNA? Where there's living organisms, there is DNA. Where there's DNA, there is genomics, and there is the potential for impact with genomics.
Thank you for that. Rob, what I'd like to ask you is that genomics is kind of this field that is responding very quickly to present issues that are going on. Like we've seen how, all of a sudden just propelled to the forefront in the last year and a half alone. But it also has to adapt and gather information for future challenges. And Catalina spoke a little bit about climate change, which, as we know from COP26, is going to be more and more urgent and has been really urgent for the last little while. But what other future applications of genomics can you think of? You're on mute, Rob. Your turn.
Yeah, it's my first time using Zoom. So I think, Catalina did a great job, I think, of providing a broad survey of the various areas where this could be applied. I really do think that there's a whole universe that is actually very hard to predict about how things are going to use. I use the digital revolution as kind of an example off the top. And I think when we thought about the digital revolution, there are whole areas now that exist, because of the web, because of the digital interface that we're using that we didn't expect. So there's going to be a whole world there, and I think that's why it's important for an organization like ours and a community like those listening in here is making investments today that will support kind of new ideas and new developments wherever they take us. And I think so we have to be thinking kind of foundationally about making sure that we've got the infrastructure in place, that involves being able to do what we do today. So yes, large sequencing platforms, for instance, but we're investing in technology development so that those platforms and others can remain kind of at the cutting edge and implement new ways of doing work. We think about omics now beyond genomics, because of course there's proteomics, there's metabolomics, there's lipidomics, there's a whole universe that is opened up based on the science and philosophy of genomics that will continue to propagate. And then we have to be thinking about how those pieces interact with each other and other elements of the health system, for instance, or other sectors. We also have to be thinking about creation of data assets that can serve as a foundation for work. So again, what are the data assets we can create in Canada that will be potentially multi-use? And here we're thinking about cohorts, for instance, on the human side, but we could be thinking about focusing on creating really powerful and general data assets for agriculture, for instance, or natural resources. So I think that's important. And then we need to be thinking about investing in people. And here, this is certainly about thinking about. We talk a lot about STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We need to make sure that we continue to invest in that, and we give our young people the opportunity to work in this space and to get the training. We need to make sure that the science is strong enough in Canada that we retain these people, that they want to stay in Canada and build out labs, build out companies. But we have to also think beyond STEM. We need to be thinking about making it attractive to entrepreneurs to want to start companies in this space. That we need to be thinking about investors and creating conditions where they can also invest in this space. And so it really is a bit of an ecosystem approach, so that when opportunities come up, we're prepared to be able to react. And we saw this with COVID. This is something we worked with the community to respond very rapidly when COVID hit our shores back in March of last year. But we often said that rapid response was 20 years in the making. That's 20 years of investment in labs and in people that was then able to mobilize very quickly when the opportunity presented itself and the necessity was there. So I do think that we need to be thinking about it in a very broad way so that we're prepared for whatever comes in the future.
Thank you. I know one of the other things that has been driving research and policy recently have been the UN Sustainable Development Goals. How do you see genomics fitting into that? Catalina?
Yes, thanks for the question, Nehal. And actually, the sustainable SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as you mentioned, were developed by the United Nations Assembly in 2015. And we see really genomics aligning very well with many of those. The target is to achieve those SDGs by 2030. And when you look at the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, we, with genomics, align with about 10 or 12 of those. Just giving some examples, you know, some of them are good health and well-being, climate action, life below the water, life on land, sustainable cities, economic growth, all basically really, when we think, using genomics to help build a much greener economy and a much more sustainable planet. So the mission-driven initiatives that we're putting now forward, and the first of those large-scale mission-driven initiatives being CanCoGen, the Canadian COVID-19 Genomics Network, is really, well, first helping us with that first SDG, which is good health and well-being, addressing the pandemic, addressing, you know, the biggest challenge and global challenge we ever had. So with those SDGs, the other important aspect for us is that it's helping us align with other global and international initiatives. Funding agencies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the European Commission, they are all using the SDGs as a way to measure their global impact. So again, what we're thinking forward and the way we're planning to align with those SDGs will help us align with this more global agenda and help us put genomics at the forefront to make Canada a greener economy and to make us a much more sustainable planet with applications on the different areas I mentioned before. So lots of potential applications. And as I say, we're really aligned with about 10 of the 17 SDGs that we should be hitting by 2030.
Thank you, Catalina. Rob, this last question before we start taking questions from the audience is for you. If you do have questions for Rob and Catalina, please go to Slido, sli.do, and use the password GC Townhall. And I'm going to go to those after this last question. Genome Canada has just celebrated 20 years. Rob, where do you see Genome Canada specifically and genomics in Canada in general going in the next 20 years?
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, that's an exciting question. And again, to reiterate, it's so hard to predict. It's so hard to predict. I think what's going to end up happening, or what needs to happen, is, you know, over the next, 10 to 20 years, we're going to need to have a much more, I would say, integrated approach to what we're doing in genomics. Genomics is going to find its way into so many more areas. But as we continue to, bring the community together, we have to make sure that we're involving all of the key players, and that's going to be certainly what we think of as maybe the core research element of genomics, but now thinking about those sort of sector players in, say, the energy sector, the agricultural sector, who are really in the field facing the big challenges. We need to be thinking about including, sort of a broader set of, say, civil society who can help us actually identify challenges that might not be sort of front and center for us. So I really see, Genome Canada playing a central role in helping to bring together an ecosystem of players to actually both identify the challenges and then, in a sense, kind of execute the effort to address them. None of this is going to happen in isolation. And again, we've learned this during COVID, that what we're doing on genomics when it comes to something like, say, viral surveillance has to feed into what's happening at, say, the public health decision-making level, but it also has to feed into what's going on the sort of vaccine development side. It has to feed into what's happening on the international side. And so those connections are going to be absolutely crucial. We have a huge opportunity in Canada to be able to apply the benefits of this technology, but it's going to be more than just a Genome Canada project. We really see our role is to help bring that community together to address these big challenges.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Catalina. Well,